everybody. If you're looking around, wondering why you're not in the same Basecamp platform to which you've been accustomed, fear not. You are in the right place. We are just going to be doing things a little bit differently in this session. So while you get acclimated and decide if you want your camera to be off or on, sit back and relax and enjoy this video that'll kick off our session today.
People who work in legislatures learn to expect the unexpected. Dramatic floor votes, impassioned speeches, citizen protests, IT hiccups, and even plumbing issues arise on any given day, sometimes in the same day. And emergencies do happen. Legislatures have prepared for and dealt with earthquakes, fires, wars, and even Y2K. But nothing before quite prepared state legislatures for how to function through a global pandemic. When American life began to shut down in March 2020, legislatures had crucial operational decisions to make, to meet or not to meet, how to keep members, staff, and visitors safe, which legislation was critical to tackle and what could wait. Should the Capitol stay open to the public? What did the Constitution or state law require? What IT options were available and what would work best? Most, though not all, legislatures met in the spring and summer of 2020. Each legislature and each legislative chamber had to create contingencies and plans for meeting during the pandemic. They enhanced health and safety protocols and tapped into new technology tools. About half adopted temporary or emergency rules to allow for remote participation. Legislatures have met in sports arenas and concert venues, met in outdoor reception tents, met in museums, met using virtual meeting tools like Zoom, met in the Capitol, spreading members out in a chamber, the gallery, or their offices during session or committee hearings, or used a combination of these approaches. Those sessions which haven't convened since the pandemic's inception are prepping, planning, and considering many of the same strategies. No matter the strategy, public access to the process is a critical issue for legislatures to address. Legislatures are, in fact, known as the people's house. Access to the Capitol means access to their elected representatives and access to the institution and its inner workings. Some state legislatures are constitutionally required to make sessions open to the public, and in all legislatures, these proceedings are available for observation via webcast or television. Many chambers are live streaming and archiving proceedings during the pandemic, too. Watching and listening to floor sessions is important for the public, but committee hearings and meetings are where citizens, advocates, and lobbyists are able to directly participate in the legislative process. They can testify about their position on a bill, explain an issue or the impact legislation may have on themselves, their communities, or their clients, and ask lawmakers to vote a certain way. Legislatures have had to carefully consider how to integrate these important actors into their new normal. NCSL's research shows the institution is accommodating public participation through a variety of approaches: streaming sessions, allowing people to testify and observe remotely, encouraging written testimony, and providing limited access to in-person or virtual hearings. About half archived some or all committee proceedings prior to the pandemic as well. The 2021 session will be yet another time to expect the unexpected. Legislatures will continue to learn, innovate, and prepare for meeting those challenges and maintaining the integral legislative processes we all rely on.
Welcome to the virtual third house, integrating advocacy into the legislature's new normal. As you just learned, there are lots of ways that state legislatures are retooling the way people access and influence the process. And our fantastic panel today will be digging in deeper into what it's looked like in different areas across the country. I'm Natalie Wood, and I'm the director of NCSL Center for Legislative Strengthening. A few housekeeping items. Many of us are familiar with Zoom now, and as I mentioned before, you're in a regular old Zoom meeting and not in the Basecamp platform we've been participating in prior. We're going to have a little bit of interactivity at the end of this session, that's why. So just like a Zoom, if you have comments, there is a chat. We'll be monitoring it as we move through the discussion with our speakers today. With that, I'll turn it over to my co-moderator, Arturo.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm Arturo Perez, Director of NCSL State Services Division. We're joined today by two legislative staff leaders, Raul Burciaga, Director of the New Mexico's Legislative Council Services, and Perry Horowitz, Executive Director of New Jersey's Office of Legislative Services, and Michael Beam, Co-Chief Executive Officer and Principal of Stateside. Perry, New Jersey didn't really skip a beat convening-wise since last March. Can you walk us through how you handle continuity of government in your legislature and how public access was integrated?
Sure. Good morning or afternoon if you're here in New Jersey. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. Let me highlight two things by way of beginning to answer the question, but also by way of introduction. And that is that the New Jersey legislature stands apart from other legislatures in that it's considered a hybrid. It's neither full-time nor part-time. The presiding officers can schedule sessions or quorums whenever they wish. It's not prescribed by law that they only meet in January or February or however it works in other state legislatures. So that's one thing that sets us apart. Another thing that sets us apart is that we have a full-time Office of Legislative Services, nonpartisan, comprising about 350 staff. And each of the caucuses in each of the houses has their own staff office as well that is also full-time. So there are a lot of full-time staffers, a lot more so I think than in other legislatures. I'm going to share my screen and show a few visuals to keep me going. Give me 1 second. Okay, hopefully this is working and everyone can see it. That is our campus in Trenton. Hold on. There we go, whoops. Okay, so let's start with this graphic, this photograph. This is what it looks like when you come into the State House right now, and has been for a while when you come in from the garage. The notice read before entering has quite a number of precautions on it. I'll talk more about those details because we've been very, very careful and continue to be very careful as the recommendations about public safety have changed, and we want the people who are working in the State House to feel safe. So it's a constant process to keep things updated and safe as possible. This is the language about the State House complex. And I want to emphasize that the State House in New Jersey has never closed. Access has been limited, but it has never been closed. And at all points since March 13th, when it was closed to the general public, it has always remained open. And employees from OLS have been in and out as needed. We're back on a more robust schedule now. But the press has never been limited. The press has always been allowed in the State House. And I think that everything that has been done in New Jersey has been done with an eye towards making sure that the public has information coming from the State House and knows what's happening. Next slide I have is sort of a timeline to show what we did, when we did it, and so forth. As I said, March 13th was the day that that notice came out. And there was a whole lot of scrambling the week leading up to March 13th, as well as the days following it. On the 16th, there were about 15 or so committee meetings that were scheduled, rescheduled, moved around, rescheduled again. Ultimately, they were canceled. The Assembly had a voting session that day, and the vast majority of bills on the agenda that day were issues dealing with the pandemic. I don't think we used the word pandemic at the time. I think we thought it was an emergency. I think nobody thought it was going to be lasting as long as it did, but there were all sorts of emergency measures on things related to education, things related to public health, things related to the legislature and legislative operations. That's what was happening then. We were also, had things been proceeding on a normal year calendar, we were in the middle or beginning budget season then. So on March 18th, the Public Budget Committee meeting was canceled. That would have been a meeting that allowed members of the public to come to the State House and each have a few minutes to share their thoughts, open-ended, on the budget that the governor had proposed. On the 19th of March, the Senate Judiciary Committee met. They had some nominations that were time sensitive, and they were doing their part to make sure that the Senate continued its advice and consent process. And the Senate met in person. I believe they met that day in the Assembly chamber, which is larger. And they also primarily voted on bills related to, again, it wasn't a pandemic then, it was the emergency. As of 3/20, I directed my staff to work remote. The legislature had an unclear schedule at that point. Again, typically they would have been entering a season when most of their activity was budget related as opposed to general committees. By March 25th, which is a very short time afterwards, the Assembly was voting by teleconference. And of course, there was a lot of discussion about how to do it, what platform to use, et cetera. By and large, we were basically just using a large teleconference line. And of course, throughout those days, we were working very hard to make sure we could do it, and most importantly, broadcast it over the internet. One of the big challenges we faced throughout this, and it permeates everything that I'm talking about, everything that we were able to accomplish, and frankly, the things that we perhaps weren't as able to accomplish, was that our infrastructure, our technology infrastructure, is not where it should be. And so that has been and continues to be a challenge in making sure that we could provide information remotely. By April 13th, both houses were voting the same day by teleconference. And of course, we had staffing issues and broadcasting issues, so we needed to make sure that they were not held at the same time. There were a lot of logistical details involving timing. Things needed to be spread out. There needed to be gaps between meetings, et cetera, to make sure that we can get things done right and test things and not go down the middle and so forth. By May 4th, the Assembly Appropriations Committee met by teleconference. We were already testing video at that point, but we didn't feel confident enough to make it go on the 4th. By the 7th, we had 2 Zoom committee meetings, and the Zoom committee meetings involved the members coming on with a secure link. Members received the link, as did members of the public who had signed up in advance to testify. And of course, that also involved logistical things that we hadn't done on a regular basis before, putting up an electronic sign-up capacity on the website and so forth. So these are some of the highlights of our journey, our continuing journey. We did 10 remote voting sessions. We supported 10 remote voting sessions for the legislature from March to early July. From May until early July, there were approximately 60 live stream Zoom committee meetings in the New Jersey legislature. We returned to work on site on a hybrid schedule in July. That was around the same time that the Senate resumed in-person committee meetings. The Assembly still is doing online via Zoom meetings. And as of now, the guidelines that I showed earlier regarding the State House complex remain in effect. You're considered an invited visitor if you've signed up to testify in advance and your name is on a list for that. With regards specifically and in more detail to the public participation, a key component was and is that all voting sessions and committee meetings are live on the legislative website. Some are audio, some are video, depends. Public testimony is allowed at all committees with advanced signups and time limits. Even from the get-go, even before we knew how long this would last, the emphasis was on providing opportunities for written testimony. Members and staff can take virtual meetings, but again, they're not being scheduled regularly. And perhaps another form of participation that doesn't get talked about quite as much is there have been gatherings outside the State House. And my understanding is that some of these, not all of them, but some of them have been done with permits granted by the state police for assemblages and so forth. And so that, of course, is a form of the public getting a chance to weigh in. Finally, I'd like to briefly go over the health and safety precautions that we have in place. Social distancing for in-person meetings in the committee rooms. Chairs have been moved and removed. Microphones are spread out. There are covers on the microphones. The rooms have capacity limits. There is signage everywhere you look in the building. You can't really go more than, I would say, 3 feet without there being another sign. There's signs in the elevators. There are signs on the floor outside the elevators telling you where to stand. There are additional cleaning services. I personally feel like you can't avoid the notice and the information and the precautions that are being taken. And I think that's not only for the health and safety of the people who work in the State House and the members when they are on site, but also for the members of the public who have participated, who are signed up to participate and are coming into the building. So with that, I will.
Thank you, Perry. Thanks. And as you know, I was in your Capitol on March 13th. It's remarkable to think about being in there with signs just about hand washing and then going into all the measures that you discussed. It's crazy how much has changed in just a few short months. Raul, we're going to turn our attention to you. And you adjourned for the year early in the year, as is per usual for New Mexico, but then you went into special session in the summer. So can you take the next 5 minutes or so to talk about how operations shifted for your legislature, what you had to consider with respect to accommodating lobbyists, the public, even the press? Talk to us about what happened in Santa Fe.
Sure. Thank you, Natalie. Thanks, everyone. Good to see so many people on here. Yeah, as Natalie mentioned, we ended early. In even-numbered years, New Mexico has a short 30-day session. So we ended ours in mid-February, and by the end of February, legislators had returned to their districts. And we were getting ready to make plans for interim committees that usually begin in late April, early May. Of course, those plans were replaced by plans for a special session to deal with the effect of decreasing revenues from all-time high levels of revenue the previous 2 years. So a special session was planned for, and it was held in mid-June. We had a total of 4 days. The interim committees were put off until late July. The first thing was the question about how we conduct a session in the midst of a pandemic. The Constitution says that all sessions shall be public, and it says that the Senate shall be called to order in the hall of the Senate, and the House of Representatives shall be called to order in the hall of said House, and that no bill shall be passed except by a vote of a majority of the members present in each House. So after a considerable discussion with leadership, it was decided that the building, the state capitol, the roundhouse as we affectionately call it, would be closed to the public, including lobbyists, and the only ones we would allow in would be the media. We concluded that we had enough technology to provide public access via the internet webcasting. We did set up a process to allow the media in the Capitol and gave them some extra space because we actually had a little bit more media than we normally do because of the circumstances. The health and safety of the legislators and staff was paramount: cleaning, social distancing, masks. I would say that the latter two, social distancing and masks, people were generally compliant, but not 100%. A lot of people gathered together to discuss issues and the like. And not everybody wore the mask when they should, but they were reminded, and for the most part, they were compliant. But backing up just a bit before we got into the special session, we ended up having a claim filed, or a lawsuit filed, if you will. It was an emergency writ of mandamus or prohibition to prevent the Legislative Council, my governing body, from closing the state capitol. The Constitution basically says all sessions of each house shall be public. The argument in that emergency writ also included a due process argument, but we didn't think it had any merit. At least in my opinion, that due process was not an issue. It was brought by legislators, interestingly, including some members who were on the council that voted to close the Capitol. Most of them were Republican, but there were a few Democrats who were included in the plaintiffs, if you will. The Supreme Court ruled 3-2 in our favor, in the favor of the Legislative Council, to keep it closed. There was an emergency motion to reconsider that, but that was also denied by a 3-2 vote. So once we got into the session, we had a few minor protests. The biggest challenge was with webcast. And as your video pointed out at the beginning, all sorts of things happened. And our webcast went down several times during the first day. So every time it went down, we had to stop all proceedings. It turned out to be a corrupt database in a server that an outside vendor had. It was resolved overnight, and we had no further problem the rest of the time. Again, the public was excluded, and so were the lobbyists. Generally, the lobbyists were okay with that because the focus was on the budget reduction. So there wasn't much, if any, other legislation to do that. We had some desktop exercises previously with the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, first responders and the like. We tested out active shooter, food poisoning, a bombing of the Capitol, but we were really not prepared for something like the pandemic problem. So at this point, we are getting ready to plan for the 2021 session, and I convened a group of legislative staff leaders to look at what we had to do. We've broken it down into about a dozen areas. One is facilities and staff accommodations. Another is capital. My 5 minutes is almost up. Capital access, whether or not we open to the public, testing, tracing, temperature checks, masks, and social distancing, meals and beverages, no more buffets, bill drafting, well, basically document handling and distribution, all the paper. Floor sessions and committee hearings, whether they're going to be in person, remote, or some kind of hybrid. Hybrid is a real challenge. That's when you have both people in person and remotely. And the lounges and the public spaces, whether or not we're going to allow any kind of congregating. If anybody's ever been to the state capitol in New Mexico, the chambers are pretty big. In fact, for the Senate, pretty much there is 6 feet between all members. House, not so much. They're probably a little closer, but still they have about 4 to 5 feet between the chairs. The House members do not have individual offices like the Senate does. The 42 of the 70 House members share 21 offices. So they're doubled up. The media, again, we're probably going to have to credential. We're going to have to deal with security and state police and outside protests if we don't allow people in the building. We need to rely on IT. Sorry, there's a plane flying overhead. I don't know if you can hear it. Accessibility issues has become a concern because we need to make sure we've got either ASL interpreters or that if we do anything webcast, we make sure that we have closed captioning. And then there's miscellaneous items that are going to come up. So that's kind of where we are right now. Thank you.
Raul, thank you for your presentation. Now we're going to turn to Michael. Michael, can you talk about your role at Stateside and how your firm and clients proceeded once some state legislatures changed their approach to meeting?
Absolutely. Arturo, thank you. And thanks to NCSL for including me, and a lot of friendly faces out there on the screen today. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this for months to come. Arturo, let me set the baseline first from my perspective. My company is a national state government affairs firm. My clients are corporate and trade association, government relation folks, and general counsel. And so my perspective is going to be less so on any kind of public interest groups or general public advocacy efforts. In terms of how we've worked with our clients, I mean, we're doing that right now and working to prepare them for this upcoming session. Like everything since this pandemic began, I think it's impossible to predict what the next 6 to 12 months are going to look like, or how it's going to affect our mobility as government affairs professionals, and probably just as important, our access to the elected officials. Before I get into how we've been preparing our clients, State Government Affairs Council just released a survey of 170 of their members, and almost 65% of the respondents said that they currently have a travel ban in effect. They're not flying to state capitals. They're not flying anywhere on business. It's interesting that over a third of the respondents also said that they don't know when they'll be traveling again. I mean, January, Q1, sometime next summer. It's just not clear. I think the biggest thing that we're concerned about and trying to work through with our clients right now are things like these travel restrictions. How are they going to get out? How are they going to get out and rally association or coalition members if they use those to leverage their programs? Raul and Perry, I think, gave a good overview about the environment out there, the capital access limited or even restricted. We counted surveying chiefs of staff and sergeant at arms in all 50 states and DC that 27 of the state capitol buildings are closed or restricted to the public, or you can visit by appointment only. And I think what's even more important that we're working with our clients on is how to overcome the biggest hurdle, and that's the access to the legislators and staff. I mean, the network opportunities have evaporated over the last 7 months. I mean, every one of us in the private sectors on this call is getting an email once a week, identifying another meeting that's been canceled. And even if we could get to the Capitol buildings, the offices are closed or open to appointments only. Fundraisers have become virtual, so there's almost no opportunity for networking or to hand that check to the elected official or the candidate. There's no more door knocking, and the evening activities don't exist anymore. The bars are closed. And that's kind of a funny note, but that's important networking opportunities to folks like us in the private sector. And people are just, I think, suffering from a lot of Zoom fatigue. What we've talked to our clients about is really lowering their expectations for the upcoming session. The 2021 session season that's coming up it's not going to be a good year for expansive proactive advocacy. I think there's certainly going to be the usual group of bills and legislation and issues that get introduced or come up. But COVID-19 related measures, economic recovery, and everybody out there knows that a whole wide range of tax and revenue raising profile or proposals are going to consume the agenda. How you fit your priorities, how our clients fit their priorities within these are going to be key to making their programs a success. But if I had to guess, and that's what NCSL is asking me to do today, I'd say you really need to manage your expectations for next session. The other thing we're telling our clients to revisit is the lobbyists they've hired. The contract lobbyists in the state capitol with the phone and the text relationship with the legislator, the leadership, the committee chairs, and the right staff, he or she's going to be the real hero next session. There's just no question about it. I think that the successful lobbyists who can reach the legislators on the floor in a committee room and pull them out for a conversation by text or cell call, those are the folks you're going to want to hire. It's going to be really hard to do our job next year without contract lobbyists. I've had multiple legislators tell me over the last several weeks that they're just not going to have the luxury to return all the calls and emails and texts that they receive this session. So the person you hire better be the right one. In terms of how we use our advocacy and trade associations, I think the local in-state advocacy associations, the chambers, the manufacturing associations, the industry associations, those are going to be the real valuable ones to our programs. And especially if you don't have a contract lobbyist. But what you need to do right now, us out-of-towners, and we're all sort of out-of-towners, is you need to build that relationship you have with those advocacy coalitions. You need to work on them now. You need to make it a very high priority. That's what we're telling our clients. If you belong to those associations, get in touch with them now. They're going to be key to next year. But also those personal relationships that we have with legislators and staff. Everyone on this call, I can see, gosh, I don't know, about 20, 25 people right now, but I heard there were 50 or more on the call. We all have relationships with the leaders and the members who participate in NCSL and the staff too. Right now is the time to inventory those relationships, find opportunities to reconnect with them. I think this is important even if you have a contract lobbyist. These relationships that we all have are the organic relationships. And you need to remember that you're only renting your lobbyist relationships for the session. A phone call, email, text, campaign contribution, find some way to get back in touch with these people. But also, I think what we've really emphasized with our clients is that, the groups such as NCSL, the 527 groups, other policymaking organizations, you really have got to lean heavily on these folks this upcoming session. And right now, we engage these groups to gain access to the elected officials and the staff, and we commit a lot of time to organizations like NCSL, and it's going to be really important. I see Caroline's face on the screen. You need to get in touch with her. You need to get in touch with Tim. You need to get in touch with all of these program staff because they have relationships with legislators. You need to find reasons to follow up and become not only a resource to the groups, but find ways to reconnect with the legislators. The relationships are just going to be key, and I can't emphasize that enough. Just a couple things that I think you're going to see next year that we're telling our clients to rely on. I want to be sensitive to the time I have. is, all of us folks, who can't get to Capitol buildings, who can't get to capital cities, the 65% of us who are parked in spare bedrooms or competing with our kids for desk space in the kitchen, you better have a good quality monitoring service supporting your program. You better have a good quality inflow of information of what's happening in the state capitals. But the other thing is, take a look at some of these other tools like social media and micro-targeting advocacy. The latter, the micro-targeting advocacy, is the newest one. It's monitoring online behavior of policymakers and staff, and really creating focused, targeted advertisements and messaging for them, and using email and social media forums to do that. And I'll tell you, it's expensive, but it's very effective in terms of getting the messaging across to the folks you need to reach. But if I can just sum this up, all of what I said, the relationships are going to be the most important thing. That contract lobbyist you hire is going to be the most important face you have in the state capitals. And I'm around to answer any questions during the Q&A period. And thank you very much again for including me.
Okay, Michael, thank you as well for your presentation. This next set of questions is for both Perry or Raul. In your observation, what has been the most effective strategy your legislature adopted with respect to facilitating lobbyists and public's access to legislators and staff and to the process itself?
Thanks, Arturo. I'll take a stab at that. Because we moved to virtually all virtual meetings, public comment is allowed in a separate room on a video conference platform that we use. We use WebEx, and those are our webcasts. That has helped. I think one of the things that's going to be key is getting the information like documents in advance out to the public and to lobbyists and like, whether it be draft legislation or proposed policy issues and the like. I haven't honestly had a lot of complaints or concerns expressed by the general public or even lobbyists about access to New Mexico legislators or staff. I would say it's somewhat of a generalization, but I would say that most established lobbyists are very resourceful and they have established contacts with the legislators. So I expect that they would be able to stay in touch. One of the challenges is going to be with newly elected legislators who don't know the process, don't know the lobbyists don't know them. There may be some familiarity from campaigns and contributions and the like, but it's a completely different atmosphere once you get into a session. The general public's access is probably going to be more challenging, more difficult, or those smaller advocacy groups that are more interested in a particular piece of legislation, having them have the kind of resources or access to legislators and staff that would normally be available by being in the Capitol itself is going to be challenging. So we, staff, are looking for ways to ensure access for public input during any virtual meetings, whether they be the session, standing committees, interim committees, and the like. The other thing I would encourage is lobbyists and the general public is to contact legislators early. If they wait, and we, believe it or not, we still have a lot of advocates or lobbyists who wait until later in the year, or right before the session begins or during session to start making contact. Sometimes it's a little too late because by then legislation has been drafted, some agreements have been made, and legislation has legs or it doesn't. So I would say start now. I think it's very important to start contacting not just the legislators per se. There's going to be an election, and in New Mexico, we're going to have at least 17 new faces out of 112. Contact the leadership offices. Those generally stay the same. Contact the caucus offices, the staff that works there, to see how they're going to accommodate, because some of this is going to be outside of what legislative nonpartisan staff does. It's going to be up to sometimes the caucus or leadership offices to open up those channels of communication. Thanks.
So I will make this observation that was shared with me by a lobbyist who suggested that professional lobbyists, contract lobbyists shouldn't have so much trouble in this time under these circumstances because they are more reliant on having somebody's phone number and being able to text somebody at off hours in weird places at whatever time. And that smaller groups, more grassroots groups, perhaps aren't as dependent on testifying before a committee, and that they get their voices heard better, louder, more clearly through other kinds of advocacy. They will hold protests outside the building, that they're more likely to send letters, they're more likely to do op-eds, and that a lot of those things are not restricted by the current environment. So I'm throwing that out there. I'm curious to know whether there is agreement or disagreement with that assessment. I don't personally have opinion. I just have an opinion about it. I just thought it was a really interesting observation. I'll add to what Raul said and say that the written testimony thing is a good thing to offer. It's an excellent thing to offer. I think it should be highlighted at all times. I think that it benefits people who are more accustomed to communicating in writing, obviously, and then putting together their arguments in a more cogent way in the written form. So that's, again, benefits perhaps a certain kind of advocate.
Thank you, Perry. I appreciate you sharing that. And, you know, part of the reason for doing our session this way is to hear from the collective and individual wisdom of folks in the room. So I encourage folks to type in the chat, particularly if there are members, legislators in the audience, and partisan staff or personal staff for legislators. I will share that I surveyed chiefs of staff recently about some of the topics we're talking about today. And I just think it's an important situational awareness element to note that what they're reporting and what is taking up a lot of member time and staff time is constituent work right now. So there's lots of, particularly around unemployment claims and some of the big challenging issues that their constituents are facing that are affecting their livelihood. That's really taking up time, well spent time on the part of legislators and staff. They're redeploying staff actually who weren't doing some of that work because the need is so great for some of that constituent services work. So I wanted to share that insight that was shared with me. Additionally, what I learned is that from the public participation perspective, some legislatures report that virtual hearings are getting more up to speed on the technology to allow them has, in their minds, allowed for greater participation potentially than there had been before. Somebody said to me, you know, we are seeing hundreds of people actually listen to our hearings, whereas we wouldn't have that many, you know, in the room listening to testimony. And I want to talk a little bit about that, Michael, get your point of view. I mean, did anything that you or your clients work on before, had anything prepared you to be adept at adapting to new strategies? And some legislatures, you know, remote testimony, for example, was allowed before the pandemic. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, we have clients of all shapes and sizes. So, I mean, you know, we prepare our clients, or at least I hope they feel that they're prepared to be a little bit more entrepreneurial in the way they approach a legislature. So the pandemic's bad. I mean, it's really bad, but the emphasis that we put on the relationship building and to increasing the touch points, I think is key. And by increasing the touch points or the access points, I'm talking about, you know, find every opportunity you can get on a video platform like this that maybe one of the groups or forums you participate is hosting. Find an opportunity to send emails or text or make a phone call to a legislator. Find some reason, whatever the reason might be, to get back in touch with staff you've met at these meetings or you've met in your state capitol visits. I mean, I really think that it's all about the relationships you have, and it's all about the right kind of advocates that you're going to have in the state capitol. It's going to be very challenging to reach folks during the session. Raul said it, Perry, I think you underscored it, is that the advanced planning is the most important thing you can do. I just think you need to reach out to these folks right now. Listen, and there's 47 days or so until this election. You know, find a reason to give a campaign check. Find a reason to reconnect with the 527 group you participate in. Have them warm up a cold call for you to a leader. I think that all of that stuff is important. I'm not sure that I exactly answered the question that you posed to me, Natalie, but what I think that in the little time I have, you just can't put enough emphasis on the relationships. And it's just, I mean, the crushing thing to all of us, I think, is the fact that we're doing this base camp instead of participating in person in Indianapolis like we should have been, or a lot of us participate in the SGAC meetings, and that thing was just right around the corner as well. And it's very disappointing that we can't do that. But the reason we go to those, I mean, forget about the hospitality events, or forget about what opportunities you have to learn something or maybe get a CLE credit. You're going to build relationships, and you're going to have those relationships to your inventory, and that's what's going to be important next year. Because if you don't have them, it's going to be hard to shape somebody's opinion about an issue, or certainly change anybody's mind.
Thanks, Michael. And I don't want to leave you without letting you take a stab at what Perry raised. What about grassroots efforts? What about those rallies and those days of action at the Capitol? What's your take on how those might look?
Well, the grassroots, I didn't mean to leave that out. I don't think that's going to change. That's going to be even more important. The problem with it is it's you're sending letters to Capitol offices that might or might not be occupied by legislators and staff. You're making phone calls, but a lot of the staff aren't in the offices. A really targeted grassroots campaign can be really effective if you know their cell phone numbers. I mean, I remember when the pandemic began and we were reaching out on behalf of a client, the governor's staff, and we had to find their cell phone numbers, and we had to find, their emails address, and we had to get a hold of them, and it was really difficult. Now we have all that information, but I would spend the next 3.5 months before session begins thinking about how I can, get a hold of some of these cell phone numbers, email addresses. That's what you're going to need, especially if 65% of us are sitting at home.
All right, well, thank you, Michael. This question is for the full panel, you, Michael, Perry, and Raul. What can legislators and staff do to facilitate a meaningful exchange of ideas and information from lobbyists and the public during these challenging times? And conversely, how can lobbyists and the public best communicate with legislators and staff? I think some of this has been covered, but I'd throw that back to the panel.
So I'm sorry, Arturo, what should legislators do?
Yes, what can legislators, the question here is, what can legislators and staff do to facilitate a meaningful exchange of ideas and information from lobbyists and the public during these challenging times? That hasn't already been addressed here.
Add more hours to their day. I mean, I think I've had a lot of conversations, and I'm sure all of you have on this call as well. And legislators spend their whole time, whether it's on these types of video platforms or answering phone calls. I suppose that they're being as accessible and open as they can, but there's limits to that. And that's like I said earlier, that you need to have a text or a phone relationship with them, or you need to have somebody who does on your payroll, because it's going to be tough.
I've seen examples of legislators doing more to communicate in an outward way. So I'm assuming that certainly those legislators are receiving more inbound communications as well. I mean, some of them have just really, I would say, stepped up their games in terms of email communications with constituents and updates and community service kinds of things and things like that. The district offices in New Jersey have slowly been reopening. They were never shut down completely. They may have been physically shut down, but everybody was working in various ways. And so I think people are talking to their legislators. I don't think it's been a huge barrier. Certainly my staff, everybody knows where to find everybody. Nobody's hiding, even whether they're working remotely or not. the volume of work generated by the legislature has only increased during this time. Again, New Jersey might be slightly different because we're continuously in session, if you will, and it is not an election year for us in the state, for state offices, for state legislative offices, but the volume of work is increasing so much. And that can only be driven by processes that involve interaction.
Thank you, Per.
Just real quickly, I would underscore what was already said about advanced planning and just getting in contact with legislators and staff early on. But it's also incumbent on the legislators and staff particularly to make sure that they have a plan, that they let the public and the lobbyists and everyone else know, in the media, what is going to be accessible. Phone, video conference, the Capitol, certain parts. Are you going to make, if you're going to close the Capitol, for example, are you going to allow the media in? And if so, are you going to give them some spaces so they can meet with legislators for press releases, briefings, and that kind of thing? And lastly, I would say that everyone needs to be patient. Starting early is going to help, but the legislative process is already supposed to be a slow, deliberative process. And under these circumstances, it will probably be slower in some respects. I completely agree with what Perry said, that the legislative work has not stopped. If anything, it has increased. And the biggest challenge that I have right now are our staff that are working from home and having to double up as teachers' aides and homeschooling and that kind of thing. That's really putting a burden on a lot of people. And I'm hoping that people recognize things are not going to be as fast as they normally are. And for New Mexico, it's going to be particularly challenging because we're stuck with 60 days. We can't go beyond that except for a special or extraordinary. It would take quite a bit to have one of those.
We want to make sure with the time we have remaining that we give you the opportunity to talk from and learn from each other, speaking of being deliberative. So with the next 7 minutes or so, we're going to put you guys in breakouts and give you the opportunity to ponder a question. And that question is as follows. Many legislatures are planning for the 2021 session right now. When it comes to access to the process from wherever you sit in this conversation, what's the number one thing that you hope is in place when those legislative sessions start? And I'll put those questions in the chat. So I'll put that question in the chat so you can see it. And our awesome NCSL virtual team is going to assign you to those breakouts now. When we, if you could, have somebody be in charge of highlighting a lesson or two or an opinion or two from your experience in the breakout and just drop it in the chat. We won't have time to report back to each other, but if you could drop off a key insight or an idea that was shared in the chat when you return, that would be great. So stay tuned for your breakout.
return to main session. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry.
Starting to see some folks come back. And just note if your audio is still on, we get to hear you when you rejoin us. So I'm seeing 75 people. That looks like critical mass to keep talking. So I encourage you to put great insights or tips or things you learned in the chat about what you're hoping to see when regarding access to the process when the 2021 session kicks off. I'll give it another couple seconds or so because I'm looking for my panelists. I see Arturo and I see Raul is back.
I'm here, Natalie.
Harry's here, and I hope Michael made it back too. So what did we learn? We'll start with our panel. You attended some breakout sessions. I stayed here and held down the fort. So I'd love your take, Perry, starting with you about what you hope's in place and what you talked about in your group. And again, please put some stuff in the chat so we can see, since we don't have time to hear back from everyone.
We kind of compared notes as to where each of the states that we represented was in their process, who's been in session since this all started and not. One of the things we ended with was that there are an awful lot of issues, and I'm not sure I would agree with that this is true in New Jersey, but certainly in other states, a lot of issues have just not been addressed. Everything's been focused on things related to COVID and things related to law enforcement, public safety, social justice, and that other things, for example, environmental issues, have not been on the front burner in a lot of states. And so going into future sessions in 2021, sort of a deluge of other issues.
Thanks, Perry. Michael, I know you have to go pretty soon. We can go a little bit over, but not much. Michael, being with stateside, you take the next shot at it. You're on mute if you're talking.
Michael, you're on mute.
There he is.
Natalie, you're going to scold us because we used our breakout session to catch up among those of us in our.
That's cool.
And I'm sorry about that. Although what I can tell you, what I will tell you is that the reason I look like I'm on the set of Masterpiece Theater is because I'm down in a boardroom at Sea Island, Georgia. There was a Republican event down here, lieutenant governors, and just so you know, I think these in-person meetings can be done, and they can be done safely. And I'll give the Republicans, I'm sure the Democratic lieutenant governors or any of their organizations would do the same thing. But they've done this very in a smart way. They've done it very safely. It's a relatively small meeting. And it's interesting from my perspective to see how this is going to operate and see if they're going to operate in 2021. But I think it can be done. I mean, if that's an observation to share with the group, I left the echo chamber and came all the way down here, but it was worth the trip.
Well, thanks, Michael. And I can see in the chat that you've impressed our staff chair, Martha Wigden, too. She always loves a good Georgia shout out. So thank you for that.
Great state. Beautiful.
Raul, how about you?
I quickly put my notes in the chat box, but I can tell you one thing that I found interesting that I hadn't thought of was just issues that are specific to a state. If you're doing a virtual access and public input, comments and the like, it could open it up to anybody outside the state that would not normally be interested. And there are a lot of hot button issues that people are interested in, whether they are in that state or not. And that could have some impact, some influence. And but generally, it's just knowing what the session's going to look like was a lot of what we discussed. So thanks.
Well, you got it. I mean, I think a lot of legislatures, given what we're hearing at NCSL and the research we've been doing, everyone is still in planning mode, that's for sure. There's lots of active, evolving conversations. Indiana and Arkansas are two legislatures that just announced some plans, at least in the press. And some legislatures, as you heard in the video at the beginning, are in special session. And and figuring this out as we go. It's great to see all of your faces. We're a minute over, so I encourage you to scan the chat quickly. We at NCSL aren't done talking about these issues, and we are a resource for you as you navigate the upcoming session and we navigate this pandemic together. Thanks so much for your time. Arturo, anything you'd like to add?
No, thank you again to all our panelists and everyone who joined us as audience members today. Great session.
Thanks.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.